Hello, everyone. My name is Alfonso Fasano. I won't say anything anymore about me because you heard enough, I guess. But my task tonight is to tell you about the neurological aspects of normal pressure hydrocephalus. So, in other words, what's the perspective of the neurologist? It's good to be talking about this after the neurosurgeons, because obviously with the neurosurgeons, from what you heard, you now have a sense of what hydrocephalus means and what we can do to help patients with this condition. These are the disclosures related to my talk, and I highlighted the ones that might be related to what I'm going to say. And I want to start my presentation with a video that I usually present at the beginning of this type of talks.
Imagine struggling to stand, walk, and suffering from memory loss, all classic symptoms of Parkinson's and dementia. But it may be a different disease altogether. CTV's medical specialist, Avis Favreau, with more on the confusion and the cure.
If you watch carefully, you'll see why John Searle was told he had Parkinson's and also signs of early dementia.
I listened to him repeatedly saying, I don't know how much more of this I can take. And it broke my heart.
But instead of worsening,
try again, a little faster.
This is John today.
Yeah.
That diagnosis was wrong. He had something called normal pressure hydrocephalus, or NPH.
Okay, so this is the story of this patient of mine. And as you can tell, he was initially diagnosed with Parkinson's and then Alzheimer's dementia. So clearly, and this is what I've been doing over the past few years, the community of neurologists should know more about normal pressure hydrocephalus. This disease should not be seen as a neurosurgical disease. It makes no sense. We work as a team, and we need neurosurgeons, but neurosurgeons need neurologists, we need physiotherapists, we need a lot of other professional figures to take care of people with this condition. But the funny thing about this story, well, probably I shouldn't say the term, I shouldn't use the word funny, but anyways, this story went viral, and also BBC talked about John. And this is a little bit surprising, because we all know about normal pressure hydrocephalus. And I always make the point that this is like saying, I had Parkinson's, I was given a medication for Parkinson's, and I finally do better. This should be common knowledge. And again, it's not, and this is part of my mandate, I guess, to make people aware of normal pressure hydrocephalus. This is a condition that, as you heard already, doesn't occur in children. This is something that happens with time, with no clear reasons for hydrocephalus other than probably an issue with reabsorption of the CSF, which is the water, the fluid that we have in the brain. And this is a condition particularly common in old age. Since the population is aging, there's an increase of the number of people with normal pressure hydrocephalus. And more importantly, there are theories saying that probably a lot of people that are currently diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, and perhaps they're staying now in nursing homes and they're told that there's nothing to do. In fact, they don't have NPH. They don't have Alzheimer's. They might have NPH. So if we transpose this concepts to the population I take care of the population in Ontario, we can probably deal at this moment with the 11,000 people that are having NPH, or they're about to present with NPH. And because of the aging processes that I was telling you before, this number will probably double in the next decade. This is a condition for which you can do something. You heard already the shunt procedure, and there are studies like this one clearly showing that if you treat people with NPH, their life expectancy is similar to people without NPH. Instead, if you don't treat them, which is these are the line, the mortality increases. This is the way NPH is normally seen. It's seen like a so-called triad of gait problems, dementia, and incontinence, urinary incontinence. There is a test that is called TAP test, which is basically a lumbar puncture. And then this leads to the diagnosis, then the shunt insertion, and this is how the patient is cured. During my presentation in the next 20 minutes, I'll tell you that most of what you see here is actually wrong. This is an old way to look at NPH. Starting from the triad, many people don't have dementia. Many people don't have incontinence. Many people just start with some gait problems, and they are not referred to see a neurosurgeon or a neurologist because they are not demented, or there's no other issue other than perhaps a little imbalance. And this is wrong, because if you wait long enough, you'll see the other problems, and that might be too late. Now we have new guidelines. These are the latest published from Japan, and those are the ones used internationally. I won't bore you with the details here, but as you can tell, there is a possible NPH, there is a probable NPH, and a key feature here is age. People need to be 60 or older. Obviously, we need to have evidence of an enlarged ventricle. The ventricles are those chambers that we have in the brain. And there are other features that we look at. And what they also introduce here is the concept of definite NPH, which are people with NPH, with probable NPH, I should say, that were treated with a shunt and they improved. This is a little bit unusual, because basically you are saying you might have NPH, but until we treat you, we won't be sure if you have NPH. So I have some issues about this, but I will not go too much into details here. We rely heavily on neuroimaging. Particularly, we would like to see the enlargement of the ventricles. We look at particular measures, and we look at this particular index called Evans index. And there are some cutoffs that we go about, but anyhow, this is just to say that we start from neuroimaging. We also look at new features like the callosal angle, which is this angle here in the coronal section of the brain. And more importantly, we look at this enlargement here, which is what we call DASH. DASH is a relatively new discovery in this field. These are basically focal pockets of water in the brain, in places where you should not see this. And this is why the callosal angle that I just told you about is acute, because the whole brain is squeezed up towards the scalp. And this is why you have an acute angle, and this water accumulated not just into the ventricles, but also outside in these so-called subarachnoid spaces. This is another important feature to be aware of, because if you only see the axial cut of the brain at the same level here, you will see this. And this might be misdiagnosed as atrophy, so shrinkage of the brain. The brain is shrinking because of dementia, maybe. And this is why the ventricles are increasing in size. It's just because there is more space. But actually, this is wrong. There is no atrophy. The brain is just trying to cope with this excess of water. And that's why you have the DASH, and you need to see the brain from different angles, including the coronal section. From a clinical standpoint, I already emphasized enough that the main symptom and sign that we look after for the diagnosis, and more importantly, for the treatment, are gait and balance problems. This is the typical patient with a wide base, because there's a problem with balance, but also short steps, issues with initiating gait or with turning. And you see the same patient after the tap test, after the lumbar puncture, with some improvement. And you see now the same patient 6 months after the shunt placement. So the tap test gives us an idea of what's going to happen after the shunt surgery. We want to see some improvement. And with this, we'll know that the patient will do better with the shunt insertion. And you'll see that actually the patient is doing even better 6 months later, because obviously with the shunt in place, there's constant drainage of this water from the brain into the abdomen. There are other problems which are oftentimes there's too much attention devoted to these problems. Yes, people have urinary incontinence, but at the end of the day, it's not a real incontinence, it's more urgency. People need to go to the bathroom often, but it's very rarely causing a real incontinence. Particularly, it's never an incontinence without awareness. The cognitive impairment is another big one. Yes, people tend to have memory problems with attention, with being focused, a little bit of apathy, but it's not a real dementia. It's not what you picture in mind when you have an Alzheimer's disease patient. They're aware of their problems. They are going to the doctor, sometimes even alone, and they tell the doctor, yeah, I'm not as sharp as I used to be. So this is what we call subcortical dementia, if you want to use the term dementia, but usually I don't use the term dementia. There are additional clinical features. Well, from a neurological standpoint, we don't want to see a number of other problems. When we see these issues that you see here listed, we know that we are probably not dealing with normal pressure hydrocephalus. We don't want to see pain, confusion, signs of weakness or sensory problems, asymmetry. All of this is clearly indicating another neurological problem. Then there are additional features that might be of interest. And we actually try to see whether we have this in each individual case that we assess. A large head. Typical question I ask my patient is whether they had issues finding the right size for a hat. Because this is a problem that patients have for many years, in some cases ever since they were born, and that's why the brain adapts and the skull adapts and the head gets bigger, a little bit bigger, so that the brain can function well. They never seek medical attention until they're 60 or 70, and there's some compensation that is lost, and this is why people have issues. The relationship with headache is a little bit debated at the moment, so I won't talk about it. Apathy is another important one, and it can improve right after the TAP test. And then there are a few others that are not really important. So the symptoms and signs I've been telling you about, gait imbalance, memory problems, incontinence, are very common in the elderly population. So the job of the neurologist here is to really do a thorough differential diagnosis. And this is just an example of how many conditions that we deal with can indeed present with this triad. And there are others. Maybe you don't have the triad all the times, but this is something else that we also take into consideration when we assess these patients. There are other conditions that can be associated. Psychiatric problems. Sometimes I've seen people with a long history of bipolar disorder. A very common one is sleep apneas. These are people that tend to snore a lot at night, and they have had this problem forever. They might have little pauses of their breathing when they're asleep. So this is something that I usually ask the bed partner. And then there are other risk factors, if anything, vascular risk factors, and even Alzheimer's disease. Some people argue that Alzheimer's disease and normal pressure hydrocephalus actually can coexist, and one increases the risk of the other. How do we diagnose NPH? As I mentioned already, we start from the clinical features, particularly gait disorders at presentation. Obviously, we look, we want to assess the brain MRI or CAT scan, and without that, we don't even want to see the patient actually, because the starting point is the imaging showing enlargement of the ventricles. And then we assess the patient from many different angles, cognition, neurological exam in general, gait analysis. And if we think that we might be dealing with an NPH patient, then we do an assessment, a formal assessment of gait. We use at the Western proper gait analysis. We use a particular gait mat connected to a computer so we can assess gait. And we see what happens after the removal of some water, 30, 40 cc of fluid from the spine. We wait 3-4 hours, sometimes even the next day we might see the response, and we basically repeat the gait assessment. We focus a lot on gait because gait is known to be the one that improves the most and the fastest to improve. Since you remove CSF from the spine, we can also look at biomarkers. There are biomarkers for Alzheimer's, or also biomarkers that we use in research. But really the most important thing here is to assess gait again. So this is one example of a patient of ours. And you see, this is our gait mat in our gait lab at the Western. The patient before the TAP test could not really lift his feet. And you see on the right is certainly not perfect, but this is what we want to see. We want to see some improvement that tells us that there is some reversibility to this process. And this is the same patient a year after the ventriculoperitoneal shunt. Fortunately, the camera lifted. It moved a little bit, but I guess you don't have to be convinced too much. This patient did very well after the shunt. In some cases, we want to do something a little bit more invasive, which is an external lumbar drainage, which is made in a different way. The patient is admitted to the hospital. That's why we don't do this too often. And a catheter is inserted in the back. And this catheter allows the removal of the CSF over usually 3 days. And this is more sensitive. It gives us the ability to pick up more easily people with normal pressure hydrocephalus, but we can do most of the time even without it. This is a controversial entity. There are some neurologists saying that they don't believe in NPH, that they think that any person with NPH has a degenerative disease of the brain. Now, this is science. It's not a matter of believing or not. It's not religion. Certainly, it's a heterogeneous condition. It's a syndrome coming from different reasons, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we know today. So it's not a single disease. That's why it's difficult to really understand what's going on with these patients. And no questions, there are gaps and controversies, as I mentioned already. And today I just want to focus on few, on etiology, and so the causes of NPH, but also the co-pathology. So as I mentioned before, sometimes people with NPH might have additional problems on top, particularly Alzheimer's disease. In Alzheimer's disease, we can actually measure with a particular PET ligand. PET is a type of neuroimaging. We can measure with this PET the amount of amyloid. Amyloid is a protein that accumulates in the brain of people with Alzheimer's disease. And what you see here is a series of 14 NPH patients. And as you can see, in some NPH patients, like patients 9 or 10, there is an increase of this amyloid protein, which indicates that these people have not just NPH, but also coexisting Alzheimer's pathology. And it's known that when you have Alzheimer's pathology, yes, you can still improve, but the improvement is less remarkable, and particularly memory tends to progress and be not responsive to the shunt, which makes sense because we are saying that these patients have basically two problems, NPH, but also Alzheimer's disease. How about the relationship with Parkinson's disease? Now, in Parkinson's, there is a lack of a neurotransmitter called dopamine. And this neurotransmitter can be measured with this type of analysis that you see on the left, that is called DAT scan. The more red you see, the more dopamine these people have. Now, this is a Parkinson's patient, and you see that there's a little reduction of dopamine, particularly on one side of the brain, particularly in this part of the back, at the back of the brain called putamen. In NPH, in 62%, in this particular study we did a while ago, we can also find a lack of dopamine, but it's a little different than Parkinson's. First, it's not just in the back, but it's also in the caudate, which is this structure, and more in the front, and it's more symmetrical. But the one thing that we found, which was quite surprising, is that if you do shunt, this lack of dopamine improves. So after shunt surgery, this is a group of people that underwent shunt surgery. This yellow bar is what you see after the shunt. You see that in all these patients, there is an increase of the dopaminergic content in the brain, meaning that with the shunt surgery, there's been a little bit of restore of the production of dopamine, which obviously is something you don't see in Parkinson's. Instead, these are people that decided not to be treated with shunt. They refused surgery. We repeated the same test, and we noticed that they actually worsened, which makes sense. So how about the cause for NPH? And this is where things can become a little complicated. We've seen that some people have NPH, but at the same time, they might have a little bit of Parkinson's or a little bit of dementia. So why is this happening? So obviously, a possible scenario is that just by chance, bad luck, these people got two diseases. And this can be the case because these are all common conditions after a certain age. You know, we see patients in their 80s sometimes. And when you're 80, you have a risk of developing Alzheimer's disease or Parkinson's disease for sure. Another hypothesis is that NPH itself causes neurodegeneration. And this is a possibility because we have now a better sense of the so-called glymphatic system. The glymphatic system is a system that we have in the brain that takes care of all the toxins, all the waste that neurons produce, and basically drains it away from the brain, and it brings it into the CSF, and then the CSF is absorbed Obviously, if you have NPH, there is a sort of a traffic jam in the brain, and this waste can be removed. And over time, this gets toxic, and this is how we can explain neurodegeneration occurring in the brain of these people. Another hypothesis, which I don't think is really the case, but I also want to mention, is that neurodegeneration, let's say Parkinson's or Alzheimer's, causes something similar to normal pressure hydrocephalus. And people are arguing that, and this is, for instance, a study from the Mayo Clinic, that this is happening in situations like this one. These are some patients that underwent shunt, they did well, but then they died. And when they were analyzed with autopsy, they were found to have a number of different conditions, not just NPH, not just Alzheimer's, but a number of other degenerative processes, particularly PSP. PSP stands for progressive supranuclear palsy, or also LBD, which stands for Lewy body dementia. The most intriguing scenario here is this one. So there is something upfront, something upstream that causes at the same time NPH, neurodegeneration, and NPH further worsens neurodegeneration. And this something is becoming clearer and clearer as we go in, as we advance in our research, especially now that we have a better sense of the genetic aspects of NPH. At the moment, there are at least 5 genes clearly causing normal pressure hydrocephalus. There are a few others that have been reported in the literature, but the very interesting part here is that all of these genes, except one, C9orf72, have some sort of function with the ciliary structures in the brain. What are the cilia? The cilia are structures that we all have in the cells surrounding the ventricles. Those are like little fingers that these cells in the brain have, and their role is to push the water away. So they regulate the flow of the CSF in the brain. So this is, for instance, the first mutation ever reported in humans in a family. And the same mutation has been introduced in the mouse, and this is the so-called animal model. And even the mouse, as you can see here, developed hydrocephalus. Obviously, the brain of the mouse is a little different than ours. Nevertheless, you can tell that these chambers, even in the mouse, increased in size because this gene seemed to be important in regulating the structure of these fingers that I was telling you about before. This is a normal cilia, and this is the cilia of patients with this mutation. And you can see that there is no structure at the center that regulates the current functioning of this cilium. So this is again this finger that is present on these neurons, on these cells that we call ependyma. And as you can see from this very complex cartoon, there are many proteins and many genes involved in the function of this cilium structure. So it's possible that a lot more of genes we haven't found yet to be involved in NPH, but I'm pretty sure that in the near future, we'll see a lot more coming up in this field. So remember, this is something I showed you before. Remember, the triad is not that important. We want to see gait disorder. That's it. And then the rest will come. Obviously, we want to see also the MRI, but you don't have to wait till there's dementia or urinary incontinence to have a diagnosis of NPH. CSF tap test is the test, yes, but it's not perfect. Sometimes we do it and we don't see an improvement, but the sensitivity of the test is not 100%. The sensitivity is about 80%, meaning that there's a 20% of patients that are not correctly diagnosed. And then inserting the shunt is not the cure of NPH. Yes, people improve, but there is still an ongoing process. And more importantly, these people had NPH forever, for maybe ever since they were born. And obviously, it would be a little silly to think that simply inserting a piece of plastic in the brain to drain some water will revert everything back to normal function, because meanwhile, the brain had sustained an injury. So I hope that I convinced you that this is no longer the way we see NPH. We're doing a lot more to understand NPH also amongst the neurology community. And as you heard before, I'm the chair of this study group within the International Parkinson's and Movement Disorder Society. And we are all together trying to figure these things out. And what's really interesting and important to report here is that a lot of people are now getting interested in NPH. A lot of neurologists are now saying, okay, yes, I think NPH exists. And again, we're trying to stay away from this kind of religious way to look at diseases. It's not that you believe or not, we just need science, and we need to understand a bit more about this condition. And finally, I want to thank you all for giving me the opportunity to present to you. Obviously, I'm happy to answer your question later today, but last but not least, I would like to thank the people working with me on this NPH program that we put together 3-4 years ago. And it is a successful story. The only problem we have at the moment, as you can imagine, is wait time, which has made worse by COVID. And we are now trying to see whether the Ministry of Health is going to give us some additional support so that we can do more of what we're doing already. But at the moment, unfortunately, the wait time is over 2 years. Thank you.